So thank you very much. Thank you very much. So this presentation will be much more focused on what can you do to recover from a debt distress, on how can you build back fiscal sustainability and resilience, on why is it important to build back this fiscal sustainability even from a debt point of view. The first slide I wanted to show you is a bit of a refresher of what are the key variables that is going to explain the variation. What are the key drivers that is explaining the variation of your debt to GDP ratio? So you have this one from a simplified version here of the dynamics equation. On this equation, on here we have only the variables, are the key one that are explaining why your debt to GDP level is going up or down from one year to the other. So the first driver of your debt to GDP ratio is actually the difference between the interest rate and the real GDP growth. Why is that? So because actually the interest rate is a little bit, I would say, the cost of your debt, right? This is one of the key elements that is driving the increase of the nominal value of your public debt. On here, what we are saying is that if the interest rate is lower than your real GDP growth, then this will contribute to a downward trend of your debt to GDP ratio. So this is one of the key elements, and that's why here what it means is that, well, both the interest rate that you are paying on your debt, but also the economic fundamentals on your capacity to generate growth are key drivers of your debt to GDP level. Yes, so looking at this nexus, both interest rate and GDP growth is here very important to assess your dynamics. The second effect that we have here is the effect of the exchange rate. Okay, the exchange rate, obviously, it will directly affect your external debt stock on the external debt stock that is denominated in foreign currency. Obviously, if you are facing large depreciation, for example, in this case, the external debt in foreign currency will be much larger as compared to your GDP that is here in your local currency. So any type of exchange rate variation will have an impact on your debt, and more specifically on your external debt. The third key variable here is the inflation. Obviously, the inflation has also a direct effect of the weight of your debt relative to your GDP, because again your GDP is expressed in nominal value. So because inflation has an impact on your GDP, so on your denominator of your debt to GDP level, it will have here an impact on higher inflation. Usually also mean, even if it's maybe counterintuitive, higher inflation would this alone lower your debt to GDP level. But actually here you need to be very careful when I'm saying this, because actually there is also a relationship between inflation and exchange rate. So these two has to be assessed together. Fourth effect is obviously the primary balance. That's the key reason of why you are taking new debt to fund your budget. Obviously it's I think here primary balance does have an effect, and actually we will come back to this on why is it that important in your debt dynamics. Last point is all the additional effects effects that is also explaining any variation of your debt. For example, let's say that some of the contingent liability risk are materializing, so you need to contract new debt to fund your banking sector or some type of SOEs that are in difficulty. This will lead to an increase of your nominal debt. Or another example also that I have in mind is that if you need to do some type of overfinancing, let's say that this year you want to get financing from domestic and external creators, so that you can finance yourself less in the next year. This will be some variables that are not included in our 4 first variables. So once I have said this, actually here we are also now kind of understanding why the IMF is one of the IMF definition of unsustainable debt. So as I'm saying here, unsustainable debt. One of the definitions that the IMF is giving is that unsustainable debt occurs when there is no politically and economically feasible policies that is stabilizing the debt to GDP ratios. So what does it mean here is that there is no politically and economically feasible policies from either the growth or the interest rate or the exchange rate, inflation, or primary balance that is enabling to stabilize the debt to GDP ratios. First part. On second part, so here we are looking at the solvency. And then on the second part of the definition is much more linked to the liquidity, because IMF is saying that we and deliver acceptably lower risk without restructuring or an exceptional bilateral support, even when you have an IMF program. So actually, this data equation is giving us some colors on this definition of unsustainable debt from the IMF. So this was the first part of the slide. The second part of the slide, I wanted to emphasize here on the negative feedback loop that we can have. So what we are seeing here is that actually we might have, from a fiscal perspective, a negative loop that is making the debt more and more unsustainable, on why the fiscal performance is at the core of this loop. Well, what we are saying here, again, because we have all these factors, actually, from a government perspective, one of the key drivers where they can play is the primary balance. Okay, so from this dynamics, what we can say is that there is a certain level of primary balance that is enabling us to stabilize the debt to GDP ratio. Okay. But if our fiscal performance is not good enough, well, we are at a point where our debt to GDP ratio is going up and up, and we are becoming more and more unsustainable on actually the level that is required, the primary balance level that is required to stabilize this debt to GDP level is way too high. So the first step of this loop is, well, you have a primary balance that is not enabling you to stabilize your debt to GDP level. So because of this, your debt ratios are worsening. Because your debt your debt ratios are worsening, well, lenders, and especially commercial lenders, will somehow lose appetite for your bonds, and this would lead ultimately to high interest rate, would themselves lead to wider fiscal deficit that is again increasing your debt ratios. So that's how you come to this negative loop. Actually, here we have an illustration here of interest expenditures when interest expenditures are increasing too high, well, you are not reaching your, you cannot stabilize your debt to GDP level anymore, and you are coming to this ballooning, to this snowball effect. Yeah, in our example here, let's say that for this specific country, the primary balance, no, the overall balance that is enabling you to stabilize your debt to GDP level is at 0%, but we are in a situation where the interest expenditures are jumping from 2 to 4%. So as a result, even if your primary balance remains the same at 2%, you will be in a case where your overall balance will be here negative, so you will be in a deficit. Because of this, you will not be able to stabilize your debt to GDP level. What does it mean also is that if you want to come back to, if you want to stabilize your debt to GDP level, but you will need to make a stronger effort on your primary balance that will need to jump from 2% to 4%. So you will need to have an even higher primary surplus so that you will be able to stabilize your debt to GDP level. So one of the way to come back to a sustainable level of debt is what we have been seeing so far, a restructuring. On how can a restructuring can enabling you to recover. What we have seen here is that, well, when you are in debt distress, what happens to your country? Well, as we were saying, you have a fiscal adjustment that is just too high, that is just not feasible enough to again stabilize your debt to GDP level. You have also some worsening debt metrics, as we were saying, and this can be also reflected, for example, in your DSA, where you might be in a high risk of debt distress or in debt distress in some cases, where the IMF is also considering your debt as unsustainable. Because you are in high risk of debt distress or in debt distress, some of the concessional lenders might not be able to provide new financing, or notably financing through debt. In some cases, MDBs will be able to provide you financing only through grants when you are in high risk of debt distress. And because of this, the amount of new financing coming in the country might not be enough to cover your needs. In some cases also, what we can have then is bilateral creditors that are no longer able to lend to the sovereigns because they are perceiving a much too higher risk. Obviously, you will not have access to the international capital market as well. Again, for the same reason, loss of confidence. On the financing available are either at way too high cost or with unfavorable conditions. For example, an over collateralized lending, lenders that are asking you a lot of guarantees, for example, community-backed or with a very high premium. And actually, this is also something that we can very easily see in countries that are in high distress, high risk of debt distress or in debt distress, is that usually they are looking first at the concessional financing. When this has been fully tapped, then they will look as much as possible on their domestic debt. When this is fully tapped, then they will look at commercial debt from certain market players that are offering offering very expensive debt with high collateralizations. And I think what we are saying here is that actually you can look at how much the country is in debt distress when looking who are the creditors that are lending money to it. So in this case, when you are in this type of debt distress, what we well, what we can say, the main conclusion is that actually there is very little path for fiscal sustainability, because you will need to do a lot of adjustment on your fiscal performance to, again, remember what I was saying before, to stabilize your debt to GDP level. So because of this, well, one of the way that you can have it is do a restructuring. So if you are managing to do a well-designed restructuring or a profiling, well, then a recovery path is opening to you with first an IMF program that is providing first liquidity to your country. In some cases, the deadlines that you have restructured have been subject to modification that is enabling you to have some breathing space, so that you can again be able to manage to stabilize your debt to GDP level. And obviously, this IMF program is also having a catalyzing effect that is enabling the other multilateral and bilateral partners to come into the country again. On this, so through fiscal space, thanks to your restructuring, through additional financing from bilateral partners and multilateral partners, well, you can expect interest rate on your debt to go lower and lower, and this will open the path for fiscal sustainability. And then here I have an example of what I was saying before, an illustration. In this case here, in the pre-restructuring, what you can see here is that indeed, before the restructuring, well, you have a case where because interest expenditures are getting higher and higher, well, you will have also an overall balance that is higher. So interest spendings are putting pressure on your overall fiscal performance. On post-restructuring, because you managed to lower, as you can see from the second graph, you are able to lower the interest expenditures that are here in orange. You are able to lower the overall balance, and thus improving your fiscal performance. Here I'm looking also how net positive multilateral inflows are also key factors in improving your debt, in improving your recovery. As I was explaining, remember yesterday, one of the key support that MDB is providing for countries that are in debt distress or that are ongoing a restructuring or ongoing a restructuring process is that they are providing net positive flows, meaning that they're providing more financing that you are actually repaying them. And what we are saying here is that before the restructuring, well, the net official flows are lower and lower, and that's why what you are saying is that actually before the restructuring you might have net negative flows, so meaning that you are repaying them more than what they are providing you, because again you are in a high risk of debt distress, so they cannot give you financings. On post-restructuring, what we are saying here is that the net official flows is steadily recovering, so now you can expect from them more inflows and outflows, and this helps you to build up fiscal and liquidity buffers. Okay. So again, so remember at the beginning, the debt dynamic equation is very key here when looking at what are the main drivers of recovering on maintaining fiscal sustainability post-restructuring, because each of these factors is very important to maintain it. So the first one, on here I'm looking at the best practices to ensure that fiscal sustainability is maintained. The first one, again, remember when I was saying that real GDP growth is one of the key factors to explain your debt to GDP ratios. So that's why having a clear multi-annual growth plan with targeted sectors is a key driver of your growth. And that's what we are seeing, for example, here in Ghana, where post-restructuring, they managed to have a very precise debt growth plan that is focused on the key strategic sectors that can boost the GDP level. It's only through this to the boost of the economy that you will also be able to stabilize your debt to GDP level. Obviously, as we were explaining, fiscal consolidation might be also key for fiscal sustainability, and especially post-restructuring, where you need to have relevant primary balance targets that is also compatible with your debt to GDP ratios and debt to GDP targets. And to do so is to have strong institutional measures within the country to be able to actually control any type of exponential slippages. Also a clear plan to strengthen your revenues, on also looking as much as possible to ensure that you would not be accumulating new areas, both domestically, even with your suppliers, and externally as well. Debt management on liquidity here also is one of the key elements. What we are seeing here is this is also usually a case when you are under an IMF program. That might be a way to control your non-concessional borrowing. And what we are actually seeing is that in some countries, even if they are not under an IMF program, they do have some type of control of limits of the new non-concessional borrowing that the country is contracting. What will be also quite useful for the countries is also looking at the MTDS, so the medium-term debt strategy, where some type of targets can be then set in terms of the average interest cost or the average maturity. That are some of the key outputs of these exercises. Obviously, here again is also another point is the level of international reserves, of the FX reserve, where some type of floor of targets can be applied on, which is also usually the case when you are under an IMF program. The last point is also to maintain fiscal sustainability. You also have to be well protected against any type of shocks, right? On any type of adverse macroeconomic scenarios might be quite important to look at. As Victor was saying, I think it was yesterday, some countries have introduced some type of catastrophe of shock clauses on the new debt instruments that is enabling them to shield from this type of events. Okay, so I will go very quickly in details of these three main points I was mentioning. First, growth plan. Why is it important? Well, you need on how do you want to design it? Well, you need to look at the key sectors that that have a lot of potential, basically, and look at the different linkages. What I was saying also before, you need to look at the different linkages for your own economy between the different sectors. So you want to focus on, let's say, very strategic sectors that have a high spillover effect on the other sectors of the economy, so that you are then making sure that the effort that you are making in boosting this specific sector will have a high effect on the overall economy, right? So here, one of the items, for example, that you want to look at is the multiplier effect. So making sure that the sectors that you are focusing in your growth plan has strong effect. On the key outcome, remember what I was saying again, on the debt dynamics, the key outcome, what you want to achieve here to stabilize your debt to GDP level is to have a real GDP growth that is greater than the real interest rate that you are paying on your debt. If you manage to reach this objective, well, you will highly contribute to stabilizing or even having a downward trend on your debt to GDP level. Okay. Another key element that is here much more focused on the fiscal performance is the fiscal rule. Here, what you want to make sure of is that you have all the elements in place so that you can effectively control your fiscal performance on making sure that, well, the budget performance that you are projecting for the years to come is consistent with putting that to a downward trend. So here, the fiscal rule, what we are seeing here is actually a lot of countries have put in place such type of rules. On what does it mean? Well, first, it means setting up quantitative targets with very simple metrics, so that you can ensure that you can actually able to monitor it. You want to also limit as much as possible the growth of your expenditure, and this can be done, for example, by clearly defining some criteria to explain the growth of your of certain budget lines. For example, let's take the example of the salaries. For the salaries, you can have some very specific, I would say, formulas that where you cannot increase your salary expenditures above a certain level that is defined by this equation. And obviously, it has to be both ambitious, because you need to have some type of fiscal consolidation to come back to put your debt in a downward trend, but also obviously realistic, while making sure that the effect of on your economy, on your population is taken into account. Yeah, on one point here that is very important, and I think it's not always well captured in the different type of restructuring, is you need to make sure that even your restructuring scenarios or your path to recover from it is also taking into account the shocks the country might have. For example, some countries that went to restructuring, well, they went to a drought or any type of climate-related risk just after. Just this is putting a high pressure on your debt. So you want to make sure that actually, even on the way that you are building up your recovery, you want to minimize as much as possible this type of risk. So today, what we have seen is that actually a lot of different instruments has been put in place to take into account this risk and to put as little pressure as possible on the government side. On one of the examples of this has been the catastrophe bond. What is a catastrophe bond? Actually, it's a way for the government to transfer any type of financial risk of natural disaster from the government to the capital market investors. So what is happening here is that you will create a special purpose vehicle where the government is going to pay an insurance premium every year. So basically you are paying every year to this SPV, and this SPV, in case of an eligible event, so here an eligible event usually is very clearly mentioned in the documentation, will be able to make some payouts in case this event is happening. An example of this has been, I think it was Chile, who did it a few years ago against any type of earthquake. So in case of earthquake, on a earthquake with a certain type of it needs to be a certain degree, well, you will be able, the government will be able to receive the payouts. So we'll be able to receive substantive money in case of this event is happening. And because of this, so basically the additional cost that the government is facing because of this event will be partially covered by private investors. So on this, this concludes my presentation. The floor is open now for questions from the audience.
Yeah, let's thank Ravi by another round of applause. And I will invite Victor to come and join Ravi on the podium so that we can have a session of a question and answer.
My name is Edward, and I'm from Sierra Leone. My question is directly to Victor Ogier. I've got two questions. The first one is relating to litigation, wherein failure for the debt has occurred. And if ever that goes to litigation, in normal contractual agreement, there are factors or elements in a contract which entails offer, acceptance, intention to create legal relations, and consideration. Now, most courts takes into consideration unfair contract terms agreement, which is at the discretion of the court. But when it comes to transition states, does the court take those into consideration where an unfair contract terms agreement has been part of that contract to void that contract? That's one. My second question again is, creditors may seek, the creditors may seek to enforce judgment obtained. If they have obtained judgment against the transition state, can that enforcement in another country be enforced wherein there is no reciprocal enforcement judgment between the two countries or a third-party country? Those are my questions to Victor.
Oui, donc je disais, je voulais intervenir pour poser ma question à Victor, parce que dans sa présentation tout à l'heure, il avait demandé à ce qu'une clause d'indexation de la valeur de la dette soit faite sur le cours des matières premières.
Une clause?
Oui, d'indexation de la valeur de la dette soit faite sur le cours des matières premières. Alors, en tant que gestionnaire de la dette, je pense que nous devons rendre robuste notre portefeuille de stock de la dette. Essayer de minimiser un peu au maximum l'exposition du portefeuille de la dette en ce qui concerne les taux variables, l'exposition avec des monnaies un peu fluctuantes. Mais est-ce que cette clause-là va-t-il... Parce qu'il faut savoir que la volatilité des cours des matières premières sur les marchés ne dépend pas ni du créancier ni de l'emprunteur. Les traders sont là pour spéculer par rapport à ces cours. Or, l'État qui emprunte, c'est pour des projets bien définis. Mais si les cours sont volatiles, cela va augmenter les charges prévisionnelles de projection de la dette qui ont été faites déjà dans le stock initial. Donc, l'objectif des gestionnaires, c'est de contenir, de minimiser au maximum cette exposition. Mais par rapport à ce qu'il a proposé, concernant le cadre de Tchad, moi, en tant que gestionnaire, je pense qu'il faut rendre robuste notre portefeuille de la dette. Est-ce qu'il pense, l'État qui assure le service public, qui, son motif, c'est le bien-être social, par rapport aux créanciers commerciaux ou c'est la maximisation du profit? Est-ce que cette clause va rendre utile la gestion de la dette optimale? Voilà ma question.
Et de l'AES. Ma question va à l'endroit d'un point essentiel qui n'a jamais été évoqué au cours de cette conférence. Il s'agit de la question sécuritaire dans l'espace AES. Je remercie d'abord le présentateur pour la qualité de son exposé. Mais je m'en vais vers la problématique de la restructuration de la dette dans les pays ayant connu une catastrophe naturelle. Vous avez pris le cas du Chili, qui a eu un tremblement de terre et où les coûts supplémentaires ont été supportés par les investisseurs. Les pays de l'AES vivent une situation pratiquement depuis plus d'une décennie. Et j'ai constaté au cours de cette conférence que le cas d'insécurité est un cas mineur par rapport aux catastrophes naturelles, alors que le cas d'insécurité aujourd'hui dans l'espace AES est une problématique jamais connue. Et nous sommes en train de le vivre. Et je souhaiterais vraiment que ce cas soit retenu par la conférence et que cela fasse l'objet d'une attention particulière, parce que nous en vivons depuis pratiquement 2011. Et vous savez l'origine de cette insécurité. Donc je voudrais poser la question de savoir pourquoi cela n'a pas été tenu en compte par la conférence.
Good morning. My name is Abdullah Saad. I'm the Director of Public Debt, or Head of DMU from Somalia. My questions, I have a couple of questions. The first one is regarding the debt to GDP ratio. In our own experience, Somalia, remember our debt to GDP was almost more than 60% before the total debt relief. But luckily now we're in a position of around 6% after the debt relief. And we're still recovering, we're in a recovery period. But when I see countries like Japan, I'm not comparing Somalia to Japan actually, because there are so many differences, and Japan is a very developed country. But I saw their debt to GDP for the last time I checked, it's around close to more than 100% actually. And my question is there, I know there are many factories, contributes to that higher percentage, because when the denominator is really high, then you know what will happen to the results. And is there a number, magic number or magic percentage? You will say, oh, okay, we are going into trouble when our ratio goes higher than that number. Are there any single factor? I mean, it could be several factors. What is the most important factor to look at it? That's my first question. The second question is regarding bonds. And I'm sure this question is not to Victor, because we're in the same boat, Victor and I. You know as much as I know about the debt relief and the status of the debt of our country. But the diaspora bonds, we don't issue bonds at all in Somalia momentarily. No bonds, no treasury bills whatsoever. But diaspora bonds, as I understand, in my own experience, was the country of Ethiopia, which is our neighbor. I think I remember they were issuing those diaspora bonds to generate revenues for the dam that they are building in the Nile. And it is, I want to gain some more knowledge about that diaspora. I know some limited information about that, but what are the conditions? How can you reissue those diaspora bonds? Thank you.
So, can you rephrase your question so that...
The first one or the second one? The first one, okay. That was about the debt to GDP ratio. I mean,
Okay.
is there a magic number that you can say, okay, since our debt to GDP ratio is rising high, the country's, I mean, going to a debt distress status. Is there a magic number when you pass that ratio, you will say we are in trouble? Thank you. The second question was about the diaspora bonds. Diaspora bonds. Can you be a little bit specific about the definition of diaspora bonds? Diaspora, D-I-A-S, diaspora bonds.
Thank you very much for the questions. They're very insightful. I think I will go with the first question on unfair contract terms. So, when you say that a contract term has been unfair, and the context that you provide suggests that based on the environmentally fragile nature of the borrowing country, perhaps the terms under which they entered that contract was not fair because they just didn't have the capacity to contract, and whether the courts would agree to that reasoning in coming to a judgment. What we are seeing in practice generally when it comes to suits, and you see this a lot with the Greek bonds, the Argentine default in 2005, and just the general attitude of the courts, is first, the courts will look at the contract you signed. And, you know, generally, I believe you're a lawyer as well. When the court is ascertaining the terms of a contract to determine if there's been prejudice, there are certain factors that the court would like to see evidenced before in proceedings. One of such is if there is, for example, mental incapacity, as I'm sure you know, or age incapacity. Say the person who entered the contract was a minor. Some of this, or both of these, can hardly be proved by a sovereign. Perhaps another way you are thinking about it is that because the sovereign simply did not understand the terms that they were entering, therefore, the courts should find in their favor. It's a very delicate argument to make. Because don't forget that justice is a three-way street. It is justice to the person who is suing, the plaintiff. It is also justice to the defendants and justice to the society. So the court is also thinking, what kind of precedents are we looking to lay down with this case? So when you say incapacity of the country, I believe that a judge will be looking at factors such as, did it go through the ordinary procedures established in the country for signature? That is the contract in this case. Have the parties who have been designated by the laws of that land actually signed? Because remember that even in evidence, the court will assume regularity for formal or official duties. So the burden of proof on unfair contractual terms, especially when it is not a facial unfair term. And by facial unfair term, I mean a term that the parties included, which the court can determine on the face value was intended to injure a party. So, like some of the terms we saw on Tuesday when we looked at the loan agreements terms and how we can negotiate them, the before and after. So the before clause is that I told you, oh, you should never sign this kind of clause. Generally, they are not so detrimentally calculated to injure the sovereign. It is just a mark of a sophisticated creditor who wants to secure their interests. So if you take one of those loan terms, for example, the loan term that says you must not disclose these agreements to any party, including your advisors. Now, on the face of it, it looks like, okay, But if you sign, a court would assume or would want to drive into understanding, did you not understand the meaning at the basic level of an advisor? But apart from that, the court will look at who signed. If the Attorney General's office was involved, or sophisticated lawyers or persons who have dealt with such agreements in the past were involved in that agreement being signed, the court would impute a presumption of understanding or regularization. So the point I'm making in essence is claiming unfair terms as a sovereign in a sovereign debt litigation is a very high burden to prove, because you effectively have to show the court that you were either not just alive to the ordinary grammar of the contract clause, or you do not have the systems at all in place to review. And that could include, perhaps in the event of war that had occurred. But in the absence of something serious that could have mentally impaired the sovereign from undertaking a honest and scrupulous review of the contracts, it is extremely difficult to convince the courts otherwise. That's the first question. The second question is about sovereign immunity, and it's a very good question. You would recall on Tuesday, I looked at a sample sovereign immunity clause and how it can be amended. And I said, for example, you want to include a phrase such as to the extent permitted by law, and you want to include express carve-outs that effectively carves out important national assets. For example, you remember I mentioned the central bank reserves. That cannot be part of a sovereign, that cannot be waived as under a sovereign immunity. I also mentioned that you cannot waive embassies or national prioritized assets. Now, generally, and this is the general rule, in law, when a sovereign is sued and based on a loan contract or a bond indenture under which they've accepted to waive their sovereign immunity, their assets can be chased for enforcement. This happened with Argentina. This happened with the DRC. The DRC against that hedge fund called FG. And this happened with Argentina versus NML in New York. Now with Argentina, NML, which was a hedge fund, was chasing Argentina's assets after they obtained favorable judgments from the courts in New York. And they were going all over the world looking for Argentinian assets. Now here comes the reality check. So while in theory you can pursue the assets of a sovereign, you have to be cognizant that the courts you are chasing those assets at would employ their own rules for determining how to chase a sovereign asset. And in China, for instance, so there was a case between Congo and a particular commercial creditor, and the commercial creditor went to chase Congolese assets in Hong Kong. Now, the courts in Hong Kong said, based on the Chinese legal principle that a sovereign is forever immune, regardless of the contract clause, they cannot grant the judgment in favor of the commercial creditor. So it's very interesting. The loan allows for sovereign immunity waiver, but the courts, because of a jurisdictional exception, refuse to recognize the assets being confiscated. And so, whilst it is possible in theory, in practice it's extremely difficult to actually chase the assets of a sovereign. And oftentimes, courts will look at the fact that we try to look at the dichotomy between what they ascertain to be commercial assets versus state assets. And I tell you, a lot of courts would look at any sovereign asset as a state asset. And state assets are generally not subject to compulsion. So that's the first question. Should I go with this? The second question is the volatility of commodity price or commodity priced loans, right? Right. And the delegate mentioned that Chad gave us an example. Now, the reality is, the moment you have changed your commodities to loan or bond repayments, what you've effectively done is to say, based on this resource, we will ensure you get paid. And the best way to go about a restructuring when you have such an arrangement is to indicate that that restructuring would include or would factor in ups and downs of that commodity, which is what Chad did. So when the commodity price goes up, you pay more. And when it goes down, you pay less. That's the realistic and perhaps fair way by which you can handle a commodity attached loan or bond. I guess to the extent you can, you want to limit how far out or how far drawn are the duration of that commodity attached to your loan. And to the extent you can, which is usually sometimes impossible given how much you've accrued a lot of loans, try to limit how much you are using your commodities as your, as your security or collateral, especially, volatile commodities. But if for any reason you must use volatile commodities, ensure you have the commodity-linked clause that links your payment obligations to the price fluctuations of that commodity.
I will switch to French also to yeah. On before that, alors juste pour compléter ce qu'a dit mon collègue Victor sur la question du risque, notamment des risques que vous devez gérer en tant que directeur de la direction, en tant que personne dans la direction de la dette publique. Bah justement, en fait, aussi ces genres d'instruments permettent également de contrôler votre niveau du risque, puisque finalement, en fait, vous transférez le risque, un risque à la partie tierce. Donc, mais encore une fois, c'est toute une question du coup de balance, de où est-ce que vous voulez mettre le curseur. Mais dans ce cas-là, en fait, finalement, quand vous savez qu'une partie de vos recettes sont liées à une matière première précise et donc vous voulez minimiser au moins en partie ce risque-là, bah, avoir de l'autre côté de la vision une dépense qui est elle aussi liée à cette même matière première, ça permet de limiter et d'ajuster entre guillemets un peu vos flux entrants et sortants. Je vais ajouter ça. On the question from our Somalian colleagues on the right level of debt to GDP, well, actually, unfortunately, there is no. I don't think there is a right answer to that. Right? I don't think there is a level of debt to GDP that is when you are above, you are way too high. I think the example that you are providing about Japan, that has a very high debt to GDP level, is actually illustrating that, right? To assess what is the right level of debt to GDP, well, actually, it very much depends on the underlying characteristics of your economy. It depends of what your banking sector, the size of your banking sector, how much your banking sector can, I would say, take some of your government debt. But yeah, it's very, I would say, it's very country specific. There is no clear answer on that. But actually, one of the ways that you can, I would say, that is providing some guidance is the leak DSF, the debt stability analysis, where here you might have some signals that your debt to GDP is too high. But again, even on the DSA, well, the thresholds that you have might be different from country to country. So the best way to do it is actually looking at your DSA, on looking at the solvency ratios of your DSA. That is going to provide you a first guidance on whether your debt level is too high for your country.
I would just quickly address the last question also from the director from Somalia on diaspora bonds. And what I just need to state for that purpose is that first, diaspora bonds are an evolving or emerging concept. What they aim to achieve or what they are targeted at are expatriates in other countries. So your own citizens who have moved to another country earning foreign exchange or foreign currencies, and then you want to tap into their wealth. And how government would typically go about this is to issue a bond targeting only expatriates. And the wisdom behind this bond is that expatriates feel some sort of filial relationship with their home countries, a desire to want to invest back home. And one of the things that led to the rise of this kind of bond is when we looked at the numbers, more than $9 billion, I believe that was a figure, comes back to Africa every year just based off of remittances from families abroad. And so the government figured, well, perhaps we can issue a bond to target this level of wealth, where we are telling the people abroad that you can invest back home, although the coupon, as we say in capital markets speak, or the interest would be lower than what could be obtainable in the normal markets. So say if Somalia would typically issue a euro bond at 8% or 7% or whatever, in a diaspora bond, the figure could be 3%. And because your people abroad know or love their country, there's a chance that they will want to take up such a bond to not just to give back, but also to subtly invest. The concern that I must flag about this bond is that you have to have a system in place where first, your citizens like the government enough to want to invest. And the reason why I say this is that despite the huge remittances to Africa yearly from citizens abroad, Africa has not been able to realistically issue a diaspora bond, and countries have tried. I could name names, but I wouldn't. The only countries so far that I'm aware of, according to, I believe it's the, I forgot the reports that I saw this at, was Israel and India. And these are two countries that have successfully tapped into the diaspora bond markets. But it's something that is emerging, and Nigeria too. Nigeria has issued diaspora bonds. In 2017, 10 million, 300 million, oversubscribed. So I'm just getting new information, very interesting, that Nigeria is one of the, I'm not surprised, but Nigeria is one of the countries that has issued diaspora bonds to the tune of 300 million. Thank you so much for the additional information. So you see, yeah, so it's happening in Africa, so perhaps, sir, perhaps it may happen in Somalia soon if the government takes the leap of faith. Ours was oversubscribed in Nigeria, so maybe, who knows?
Okay. I think we are running out of time because the formal closing ceremony is scheduled to start at 11. So we can have one round of short question before breaking for coffee. The floor is open.
Oui, thank you. Bonjour à tous, Yubi de Madagascar. Merci pour les présentations de tout à l'heure et merci pour les autres présentations durant les autres jours. J'ai une question par rapport à la technique de négociation. Il a été dit que toutes les clauses sont négociables, même les clauses standards. Quels seraient donc les arguments qu'on pourrait avancer pour négocier la modification des clauses standards? Voilà la question sur la technique de négociation par rapport au niveau d'influence du pays. Quel serait ce niveau d'influence si on est noté B- par les agences de notation? Quelle serait la position du pays donc, en matière de négociation? Est-ce qu'on peut espérer négocier et différencier par rapport aux propositions faites par les partenaires techniques et financiers? Merci.
Je remercie tous les présentateurs pour leurs exposés, en tout cas très très clairs. Et là, j'ai épinglé en particulier la dernière présentation faite par M. Oje. Il a insisté sur le fait que les actifs souverains doivent être protégés. Alors, il nous a parlé de la mutation que pourraient connaître les juridictions anglo-saxonnes, notamment avec les projets de loi qui sont à l'examen, que ce soit au niveau de New York ou de l'Angleterre. Alors, peut-on croire qu'avec cette mutation, la question des fonds vautours va maintenant être reléguée au calendrier grec, parce que la RDC en a énormément souffert. D'ailleurs, nous avions sollicité la facilité juridique et l'accompagnement de la CLF sur la question. Voilà un peu notre préoccupation. Merci.
Bonjour, moi c'est Youssouf Fofana de la Guinée-Conakry. Donc, j'avais une question générale à poser au niveau des facilitateurs, des différents facilitateurs. Parce que j'ai remarqué qu'au niveau de la dette, tous les pays africains ne font que s'endetter. Est-ce que la dette n'est pas un outil de pression, d'influence géopolitique ou de développement? Fort de constater que beaucoup de pays africains ne font que s'endetter depuis des décennies, mais leur situation économique reste à désirer. Est-ce qu'il ne faudra pas penser à un autre mécanisme pour renverser cette tendance ou de paradigme? Donc, c'était ça ma question.
Merci, El Hadji Mohamed du ministère des Finances de l'Union des Comores. C'est sur l'analyse de la dette et sur la méthode. Je crois qu'on n'intègre pas suffisamment un élément qui a plus de répercussions dans la disponibilité, donc dans le remboursement de la dette, la pression fiscale. D'ailleurs, ça revient, même si on ne dit pas son nom, ça revient dans les analyses ici. Pourquoi le Japon est solvable à 44 ou à plus de 70%, à 115%, un autre pays à 30% ne l'est pas. Donc la réponse est dans la pression fiscale, la faiblesse de la pression fiscale. Donc le taux d'informalité du pays qui génère un manque à gagner, et qui fait qu'on n'a pas la disponibilité nécessaire pour rembourser les dettes. Donc c'est un élément qui a un impact dans l'endettement du pays. Des pays sont indexés, vous le savez mieux. Le Nigeria, les Comores ont une pression fiscale très faible, d'autres en ont un peu plus, mais l'Afrique subsaharienne, je crois que c'est une des causes du manque de liquidité pour rembourser la dette. Merci.
Ok, je voulais m'adresser à Nabi par rapport au facteur d'accumulation de la dette. L'orateur a fait mention que pour stabiliser la dette, il faut améliorer le solde primaire. Et vous savez que nous sommes dans un contexte où beaucoup de pays africains font face aux questions de la dette. Et là, surtout, la question de pression fiscale se pose avec acuité parce que on a des difficultés à mobiliser les ressources nécessaires pour financer les dépenses publiques. Alors, est-ce que ce facteur est vraiment pertinent pour le cas des pays africains, surtout l'amélioration du solde primaire?
Merci beaucoup. Ma question est un peu en marge des diverses thématiques qui ont été développées lors de l'atelier, mais permettez-moi de la poser quand même. Il s'agit du système de la crypto-monnaie qui prend beaucoup d'ampleur de plus en plus à travers le monde. Et récemment, même les États-Unis, par l'intermédiaire de leur président, a assoupli la méfiance légale vis-à-vis du système. Je voudrais savoir, selon vous, quel développement on peut attendre de ce système. Je crois qu'on ne doit plus l'ignorer. Et quel pourrait être l'impact sur le système monétaire traditionnel classique?
Merci bien, monsieur le modérateur. Je voudrais revenir un peu sur la question qui avait été posée par le Mali concernant les chocs sécuritaires. Parce qu'effectivement, dans les échanges, on n'a pas pu percevoir la prise en compte de ce choc qui est capital pour certains pays dans les facteurs qui peuvent peut-être déclencher des clauses de report de dette ou de rééchelonnement, etc. Est-ce qu'on ne pourrait pas prendre mieux en compte ce facteur-là, qui est aussi un facteur un peu imprévu quand on élabore les conventions? La deuxième question était effectivement relative aux offres. Dans les pays, il y a beaucoup d'offres de financement, mais la crédibilité n'est pas très sûre. C'est-à-dire les offres ne sont pas très crédibles, je vais dire. Mais pour évaluer cette crédibilité, nous n'avons pas de moyens, nous n'avons pas beaucoup d'outils pour pouvoir évaluer. Quelqu'un, par exemple, qui te propose un financement peut-être non remboursable sur 20 ans, à condition que tu signes, par exemple, une garantie souveraine. Je prends l'exemple pour que les gens puissent voir la problématique. On te dit, tu signes une garantie souveraine, mais ce n'est pas un prêt qu'on va te donner. Mais on va te donner quand même un financement.
Okay, thank you once again for these questions. I'll take all the questions that were addressed specifically to me. There was a question on the general landscape of debt and how it doesn't really, or we have not seen it impact the continent positively. I may take a first stab, and maybe Rabbi may come in and add a few thoughts. But on the question of negotiation tactics asked by the delegate from Madagascar regarding how to address standard clauses. Here's the thing, and I believe I made this point also on Tuesday, which is when we talked about this more broadly. When negotiating a loan documentation, there are a few things to have or to take into consideration or have in mind. And one of the points I made was recognize where you stand as a sovereign in terms of your negotiating power. The reality remains that a loan agreement is just that, an agreement. And you know generally, imagine, and this is not to cast aspersions or anything, but a negotiation between a 30-year-old and a 5-year-old, even if they agree, would not ever really be equal. You just imagine, negotiating with, say, a child, for instance, and because you have significantly higher power than that child, you can navigate more easily around that agreement. Unfortunately, that parallel also plays out in the markets, so that if a country has a very low credit rating, creditors tend to be a bit more firm because they come from the assumption that they are taking on more risk in lending to you. And so they may be a bit more inflexible to your demands. And which is why on the very first day, one of the points I tried to emphasize was relief on its own does not endure. Relief must be accompanied with reform. The stronger you are, and there are good African examples of countries who have come back from a debt distress and have come out stronger. We have some of them in this room today who their negotiating power today cannot be compared to their negotiating power a decade ago because they've improved their fundamentals. So that being said, you also remember that I made the point about it is standard arguments. Creditors always like to put this forward and say, oh no, it's standard, this is what we must do. And your role as debt managers, as ministries of finance officials, is to always challenge the assumption. When you say it is standard for a sovereign or a corporate? And more importantly, is it standard for an African sovereign or a European or elsewhere sovereign? And these are questions you want to keep putting forward to the creditors. The reality is that it's an agreement, so it's okay for you to go back and forth. What we don't want is you accept everything they give to you wholeheartedly. You have every right to negotiate, to push back, and disagree, regardless of your negotiating power. But your negotiating power is what can inform the outcome of your pushbacks. The second question that came to me was with new development curb voucher funds, the new developments in New York and the developments in England and Wales, by virtue of those parliamentary interventions. I'll say this: before the parliamentary interventions, we have collective action clauses. And collective action clauses were more or less introduced in 2014 during the Greek restructuring as a way to curb these holdout creditors. I believe in DRC's case, you were going against, was it FG? That's hedge fund. And what happened was the agreement or the bond indenture in place did not have a collective action clause. And as I defined the other day, collective action clause is a clause that effectively binds a minority or a holdout to what this majority has agreed to. If you have a collective action clause in your bond, you're effectively saying once 75% of creditors agree to this, the remaining 25 cannot disagree. And if they disagree, they will be bound compulsorily by virtue of the agreement of the 75%. So in the first instance, there's already a contractual leeway for countries that by virtue of the CAC, you may escape the nagging teeth of these hedge funds. But also, these interventions by the parliament, whilst it is encouraging, it has not been passed. And I know that the UK bill, for instance, is in its third stage at the parliament. New York is struggling a bit more because, you know, the US is a capitalist, a very full-on capitalist economy, and they are really driven by commercial interests. And so there's a lot of pushback still on New York law. So that's what I can say. CACs are your lifeline, and maybe don't depend so much on these parliamentary interventions in case they don't come through. And I think the third question I will handle would be security shocks. I know it was asked earlier. Sorry for not addressing it. When we spoke about building resilience in loan documents, this was on Tuesday, I believe, or Wednesday, we talked about how the market is moving towards recognizing various kinds of shocks. And I believe I recall that a question to this effect was posed by someone here, and we addressed it by saying security shocks fall under humanitarian crisis, and humanitarian crisis is broadly recognized as one of the buckets under which a CRDC, a climate resilience debt clause, or what we call POS clauses more generally, can find its realization. So you can include in your debt, your POS clause, in your new debt agreement, that a security tension or a war-like situation is of a pandemic level, or if it's of a situation or disaster that requires a pause. And as you remember, we talked about how you can trigger this. You want to include in that clause that just the trigger you would prefer would, be a soft trigger, so that once the government announces that there is a war-like situation, then your pause clause can be activated. But also remember that the creditors will likely push for a hard or a parametric trigger. We discussed this yesterday. And what that effectively does is there has to be a concrete, physical, observable, and measurable impact of that event before it can be categorized as a post-clause worthy event. So yes, you can include security shocks as one of your post-clause situations. I think that's all for me.
Thank you very much. So I will take the rest of the questions. The first one being on the question of changing of paradigm, right? Like, okay, c'est une question en français, donc je vais répondre en français. Donc la question de changer de paradigme vis-à-vis de la dette et voir quelles sont les autres solutions qui peuvent être possibles. Alors effectivement, il y a d'autres solutions possibles, qui peuvent être par exemple travailler beaucoup plus avec le secteur privé. Mais donc, en réalité, finalement, c'est juste une question de, plus généralement, où est-ce que vous voulez situer l'État dans votre économie et quelle est la place de l'État dans le reste de l'économie et quels sont les moyens dont dispose l'État pour pouvoir répondre à la fois aux besoins régaliens mais aussi voir jusqu'où vous souhaitez que l'État prenne de la place. Et justement, je trouve que cette question-là est très liée à la question des collègues du Comore qui disaient que justement une des principales causes à regarder, c'est effectivement la pression fiscale. Et effectivement, la pression fiscale qui est une des raisons pour lesquelles un pays ne peut pas contracter davantage de dettes, puisqu'il n'a pas en effet par la suite les ressources pour pouvoir la rembourser. Et c'est d'ailleurs pour cela que quand on regarde nos ratios d'endettement, parmi les ratios regardés, on a effectivement le ratio service de la dette sur recette, pour pouvoir à chaque fois pouvoir évaluer constamment si on a ces capacités-là. Et encore une fois, ça explique aussi, vous vous rappelez quand je montrais les différents facteurs qui expliquent l'évolution de la dette, c'est là aussi que la performance fiscale est très importante, puisque derrière le déficit primaire ou la balance primaire, on a aussi, avant ça, les recettes et les dépenses de l'État. Et effectivement, quand je parlais des différentes manières de... alors comment on dit en français maintenant, de se remettre d'une situation de stress de la dette, une des manières, c'est justement d'améliorer cette performance fiscale qui va à la fois, comme je le disais, via des règles fiscales, mais aussi par des manières de mobiliser davantage de recettes. Donc, mais effectivement, je suis tout à fait d'accord que en fait, la question de la pression fiscale, et on le voit avec beaucoup de pays en transition ici, est clé, et le fait d'avoir un faible taux de recettes sur PIB est clairement contraignant. Et d'ailleurs, ça me permet aussi de faire du coup le lien avec la question du Tchad sur la question du déficit primaire qui devrait être ou pas pertinent pour l'Afrique. Alors, le point que je voulais mettre en fait dans ma présentation, c'était de dire que le déficit primaire est un facteur qui va expliquer l'évolution de votre ratio dette sur PIB. D'accord ? Donc, c'est un facteur qui est indéniable. Et ensuite, voir comment on l'approche, ce facteur-là. Et en fait, de dire que justement, on peut certes avoir un déficit primaire qui est important, mais ce déficit primaire qui est peut-être plus important pour pouvoir répondre aux besoins de votre population, il doit être aussi accompagné, il doit avoir un vrai impact. Il doit avoir un vrai impact sur votre économie, sur votre taux de croissance, sur votre inflation, etc., pour pouvoir être soutenable. En fait, la vraie question est là, c'est est-ce que le déficit primaire, mon niveau de déficit primaire est soutenable ou pas? Et ça, ce niveau de déficit primaire soutenable, il s'apprécie justement avec les autres variables de mon équation.
Ok, je pense qu'on va s'arrêter là et je rejoins Rabi, notre ami du Comore, pour dire que pour se passer de la dette, il faut que nous puissions avoir une autonomie financière et cela vient par la mobilisation de plus de ressources, la pression fiscale. Et vous voyez que dans les deux sous-régions BCAO et BAC, la pression fiscale dans la présentation, c'était 14% en moyenne. Même ici au Ghana, en 2007-2008, c'était 18%, mais aujourd'hui, c'est retombé. Donc, si on veut se passer de la dette, il faut augmenter la pression fiscale. OK, I think that we're going to break here. I would like us to give a round of a big applause to our facilitator, Victor and Rabi.